So, when does life legally end? You'd think that'd be a simple question, right? But it turns out the answer is wrapped up in this 40-year-old law it's facing a full-blown crisis. Let's dig into why this long-standing definition of death is suddenly on trial.
Yeah, for over 40 years, one single law has defined death for most of America. It gave us a clear, uniform standard. But what happens when science, ethics, and the actual words of the law all start pulling in different directions? Well, that's exactly where we find ourselves today.
So, to really get a handle on why this is such a mess now, we've got to rewind the clock a bit. Let's look at the problem this law was originally designed to fix. Okay, so picture this. It's before the 1980s. Medical tech, especially ventilators, is getting really good. So good, in fact, that it creates this strange limbo. You could have a person whose brain had completely and permanently stopped working, but a machine was keeping their heart beating and lungs breathing. Doctors, families, they were all stuck in this terrible gray zone. Something had to be done, right? This massive uncertainty led to the creation of the Uniform Determination of Death Act, the UDDA, back in 1980. And honestly, the solution they came up with was pretty brilliant. The UDDA basically says there are two ways a person can be declared legally dead. First, the old school way. Their heart and lungs have irreversibly stopped working. Simple enough. Or, and this was the game changer, there's an irreversible stop to all functions of the entire brain, and that includes the brainstem. This second part, what we call brain death, was totally revolutionary. And you know what? It worked. For the next 40 years, this law became the gold standard for defining the end of life across the country. I mean, think about it. For 4 whole decades, this one law brought so much stability and clarity. Hospitals knew what to do. Doctors had clear guidelines to follow. The courts had a solid legal foundation. By pretty much any measure, it was a huge success. How successful are we talking? Well, a whopping 37 states, plus DC and the Virgin Islands, adopted this law almost word for word. It created exactly the kind of uniformity that creators were hoping for. It was a big deal. But there's always a but, isn't there? Even while everything seemed to be working so well, there was this quiet tension brewing under the surface. See, while doctors on the front lines, the clinicians and neurologists, pretty much accepted brain death as a fact of life, or, well, death, a lot of philosophers and ethicists were raising some serious objections right from the very start. And eventually, that quiet philosophical debate wasn't so quiet anymore. It started to spill over into the real world as medical practice itself began to show these small but really significant inconsistencies. It was like tiny cracks starting to appear in the foundation of this 40-year-old law. Okay, to really get what's going on, you have to break it down into 3 pieces. Think of it like this. First, you've got the big philosophical definition of what death even is. Then you've got the legal criterion, the standard the law sets. And finally, you have the medical tests, the actual procedures doctors use. The whole crisis we're talking about today, it's happening because that middle piece, the criterion, what the law says, and that last piece, the tests, what doctors do, they just don't line up perfectly anymore. And that's the real heart of the problem. The law from 1980 was written in these very strict, absolute terms. But what we've learned over the last 40 years is that biology, well, it's messy. It doesn't always fit neatly into the law's black and white boxes. So here's maybe the biggest conflict of all. The law says all brain functions have to stop, all of them. But now we know that up to half of the patients who meet all the clinical signs for brain death still have this tiny bit of hormone-regulating activity in a small part of the brain called the hypothalamus. It's a tiny, tiny biological signal, but legally, it's a huge problem because it directly contradicts the absolute wording of the law. And here's another one. It's subtle, but it's so important. The law uses the word irreversible, which means something cannot be brought back with today's technology. But in the real world, especially with organ donation, doctors often work with permanent cessation. That means function has stopped, and because there's an order not to, nobody is going to try to restart it. See the difference? Can't be done versus won't be done. They sound similar, but legally and ethically, that's a world of difference. And it doesn't stop there. All these other questions have popped up that the original lawmakers in 1980 just never saw coming. Like, should doctors need a family's permission to even run the tests for brain death? What about religious objections? New Jersey actually passed a law for a religious exemption way back in 1991. And now some people are even asking if we should be able to choose our own personal criteria for death. It's just gotten incredibly complicated. So, with all these problems piling up, the experts basically said, okay, enough is enough. It's time to act. The plan was simple, at least on the surface. Let's update this law for the 21st century. So, in 2021, the Uniform Law Commission, yep, the very same group that wrote the original law, kicked off a formal process to revise it. They started with a study committee, which looked at all the issues and said, yeah, this thing definitely needs an update. So they created a drafting committee to actually rewrite the law. The whole thing was supposed to go to a final vote in 2023. And their goal was crystal clear. It seemed totally logical, right? Medical practice has changed, so let's change the law to match reality. I mean, it makes a lot more sense to update a law than to ask every doctor in the country to pretend the last 40 years of science didn't happen. So you have the country's top legal, medical, and ethical experts all working on this for years. So what happened? Well, the answer really shows you just how incredibly deep and thorny this whole question is. It failed. The whole thing. In September 2023, the revision effort was just stopped indefinitely. After all that work, they simply could not agree on what to do next. The problems were just too tangled, too difficult to solve. And this quote from a 2024 article really sums up why. You had inertia. It's just hard to change something so established. You had the current political climate, which makes agreement on anything tough. You had the massive implications of changing the legal definition of death. And then you had all the stakeholders with completely different perspectives. Put it all together, and getting a new agreement was just impossible. So where does that leave us? With this huge unanswered question. That 40-year-old law, it's still the law of the land, but we know its foundation is full of cracks. And it really makes you think, if the top legal, medical, and ethical experts in the country can't agree on a fix, then who should get to define death?